Before the greatest blessings of your life, God often tests you. But many miss the very signs that prove He is preparing them. If you fail to recognize them, you may walk away from the very breakthrough He had planned for you. There are moments in your life when you begin to ask, God, are you even listening to me? Why does everything seem darker right before I expected light? And yet, it is often in that very moment that God is closest. The greatest blessings He gives are not poured out carelessly. They are prepared, tested, and proven. But before He opens the windows of heaven, before He gives a blessing that could change your life, He sends 3 signs. And if you miss these, you may mistake preparation for punishment, you may confuse His discipline for abandonment, and you may walk away just before the breakthrough comes. That's why you need to stay through this message. Because once you see these 3 signs, you'll never again doubt what God is doing behind the curtain of your suffering. Before every great blessing, God allows a period of testing that shakes your foundation. This is not because He delights in pain, but because He refuses to build blessing on a weak structure. Think of Job stripped of everything, yet refined into gold. Think of Abraham asked to place his promised son on the altar. God tests not to destroy, but to reveal whether your faith rests on Him or on what He gives. The blessing is too great to rest on shallow trust. If you are being pressed, crushed, and driven to your knees, don't mistake it as abandonment. It is preparation. God is saying, if you can trust me in the silence, you will glorify me in the blessing. Another sign before God pours out blessing is the shutting of doors you thought would always remain open. People walk away, opportunities collapse, resources dry up, and you wonder, why is God removing everything from me? But do you not see? He removes the counterfeit so that when He places the true blessing in your hands, you will recognize it. Israel had to leave Egypt before they could inherit Canaan. Ruth had to walk away from Moab before she could step into the lineage of the Messiah. Closed doors are not the evidence that God is done with you. They are proof that He is clearing the way for something greater than you imagined. And finally, before every big blessing, God stirs a holy restlessness in your soul. You begin to feel uncomfortable with things you once tolerated. The sin you once ignored now burns your conscience. The comforts you once enjoyed no longer satisfy. This is not frustration, it is transformation. God is shaking you because He is moving you. He is breaking you out of spiritual sleep to awaken you for what is coming. When you feel restless, when nothing in the world can quiet your spirit, it is God telling you, you were not made for this level. I am calling you higher. There are moments in the life of every believer where the soul feels as though it is being stripped bare, where prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling, and where circumstances appear to crush the very breath out of your chest. These are not random afflictions or meaningless struggles, but rather the hand of God at work in ways we often cannot perceive. Before every great blessing, before every breakthrough that truly comes from above, there is always a time of testing. This testing does not come to entertain you, nor is it some cruel twist of fate, but it comes because the living God refuses to build His greatest blessings upon a foundation that is not strong enough to bear their weight. Imagine a building that rises higher than the clouds. If the foundation beneath it is shallow, if it is weak, it will collapse under its own weight. The same is true with the blessings of God. The greater the blessing He has prepared for you, the deeper the testing must be, because He will not allow what He gives to destroy you. Think of Job. Here was a man described as blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. Yet he was brought into a storm of suffering so violent that most would have cursed God and died. Job lost his children, his wealth, his health, and the respect of those around him. But God had not abandoned Job. In fact, Job's trial was the very evidence that God trusted him to bear witness to the world, that faith does not rest on gifts but on the giver. Job's name today is not remembered for his wealth or his prosperity, but for the faith that endured when everything else was stripped away. If God allowed Job to be tested before He restored him with double, should it surprise us that He allows the same for us before He blesses us? Think of Abraham, the man to whom God promised a son, a lineage, descendants as numerous as the stars. After decades of waiting, the son was finally given. Laughter filled the house of Abraham and Sarah, and the promise seemed complete. But then came the test. God spoke and said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering." Could you imagine the torment of such a command? Could you imagine the confusion? Yet Abraham obeyed, not because he understood, but because he trusted. He bound Isaac, laid him on the altar, raised the knife, and in that moment, God saw that Abraham valued him above even the dearest promise. The blessing of nations, the covenant that would bless the entire earth, could only rest on a man who loved God above all else. The test revealed the heart, and the blessing followed. And so it is with us. God allows us to walk through fires that seem unbearable, but the fire is not there to consume us, it is there to refine us. A refiner of silver does not abandon the metal in the fire to destroy it. He watches carefully, removing impurities, and only when he sees his own reflection in the silver does he pull it out. In the same way, God is not blind to your suffering. He has his eye on you in the testing, and he is shaping you into a vessel that can carry his blessing without cracking under its weight. The truth we so often miss is that blessing without testing destroys. How many people have fallen when they were given wealth too quickly, when they were handed influence without maturity, when they were lifted up in front of others without first being humbled before God? The gift becomes an idol. The platform becomes a snare. The abundance becomes a chain that drags the soul into ruin. God loves you too much to allow that. So when he prepares a blessing, he first prepares you. And preparation always feels like breaking. It is in the test that you learn whether your faith rests on circumstances or on Christ. It is in the silence of unanswered prayers that you discover whether you love God for who he is or for what he gives. It is when your strength fails, when friends forsake you, when doors close, when nights are long and tears fall heavy, that the question rises, will you still cling to him? And in that clinging, in that desperate cry of, though he slay me, yet will I trust him? Your faith is proven genuine. The great danger is that many confuse testing with abandonment. When the trial comes, when the crushing begins, the enemy whispers, see, your God has left you. He no longer hears your prayers. He no longer loves you. And too many believe that lie and walk away. But hear me, your test is not abandonment. Your suffering is not proof of his absence. On the contrary, it is the signature of his hand at work, because he disciplines every child he receives, and he refines every servant he plans to use. If you feel pressed on every side, it is not because God is finished with you, but because he is preparing to entrust you with something weighty. Look back at the stories of the saints. Joseph was given a dream of greatness, but before he sat on a throne, he sat in a pit. Before he wore the robe of authority, he wore chains as a prisoner. Before he was second to Pharaoh, he was forgotten in the darkness of a dungeon. What was happening? God was testing him, shaping him, strengthening him. If Joseph had gone straight from the dream to the throne, he would not have been the man God needed to preserve nations. It was the test that produced the character, and the character made room for the blessing. When you are tested, everything inside you cries out for relief. You pray for the burden to lift, for the fire to end, for the valley to be over. But what if the very valley you despise is the soil in which God is planting the roots of your blessing? What if the weight that presses you is building the endurance you will need when the blessing comes? What if the silence is teaching you to hear his whisper more clearly than the applause of men? The test is not random. It is designed. It is personal. It is surgical. God knows exactly how much to allow, and he knows what it will produce in you. The scriptures say that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and endurance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. The blessing God has prepared for you is not small. It is not shallow. It is not temporary. It is eternal. It is weighty. And it demands a faith that has been proven in the fire. So when the testing comes, do not despise it. Do not run from it. Do not misinterpret it as his rejection. Instead, see it for what it is, the hand of a father preparing his child, the wisdom of a builder preparing his structure, the love of a refiner preparing his treasure. You may not understand it now, but one day you will look back and say, Had it not been for that fire, I would not be standing in this blessing. Had it not been for that crushing, I would not have been able to carry this weight. Had it not been for that silence, I would not have learned to treasure his voice above all else. When God is preparing to release a blessing that will alter the course of your life, one of the clearest signs is that he begins to shut doors. This can be one of the most painful and confusing seasons, because those doors are often things or people you thought would remain with you forever. A job that seemed secure suddenly ends. A relationship you depended on dissolves. Opportunities that appeared within reach collapse without explanation. At first glance, it feels like rejection, like failure, like your prayers have fallen into a void. But what feels like loss is often God's way of clearing the path, removing what would hinder you, and preparing you to recognize his true provision when it arrives. Closed doors are not random. They are purposeful, and they are deeply spiritual in meaning. Consider Israel in Egypt. For 400 years, they lived under the shadow of Pharaoh's hand, and even in their bondage, they became accustomed to life there. The routine, though harsh, became familiar. But God had destined them for a land flowing with milk and honey, a promise sworn to their fathers. To bring them into that blessing, he first had to break them out of Egypt. The plagues, the hardened heart of Pharaoh, the sudden expulsion from the land, all of it was God slamming a door that would never again open to his people. Imagine how terrifying it must have been to walk away from what was known into a wilderness with no certainty. Yet it was that closed door that led them into covenant, into promise, into inheritance. Without the shutting of Egypt, they could not have entered Canaan. Think of Ruth, a widow in Moab. She buried her husband, and with him, many of the dreams she thought her life would hold. In her grief, she had a choice: remain in Moab, the land of familiarity, or follow Naomi into a future she could not see. The door to Moab, to the life she had once known, had closed forever. Yet that very closed door positioned her in Bethlehem, where she would encounter Boaz, where she would become part of the lineage of David, and ultimately the Messiah himself. The loss she experienced was not God's abandonment, but his redirection. A door had shut, but it was only to open the way for a greater destiny she could not have imagined. Closed doors in your life may feel like betrayal or disaster, but they are often mercy in disguise. You do not see what God sees. You see the immediate comfort, the short-term security, the surface-level promise. He sees the hidden traps, the unseen compromises, the long-term consequences that would destroy you if you remained. So, in his wisdom, he shuts the door, and though you may pound on it with tears, he will not open it. He loves you too much to allow you to settle for less when he has destined you for more. The pain of closed doors is often intensified because they challenge our trust. We say with our lips that we believe God has a plan, but when he interrupts our own, our faith is tested. We cling to what is familiar, we grasp for what we think we cannot live without, and in doing so we resist the very hand that is guiding us. Yet throughout Scripture, the pattern is clear: doors must close before blessings can unfold. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, closing the door on his youth and his freedom. Potiphar's false accusation closed the door on his reputation and his stability. The prison cell seemed like the final door shut forever, but those very closures were necessary steps on the path to the palace. Had one of those doors remained open, Joseph might never have reached the throne God had prepared for him. There are moments when you must discern the difference between the enemy's attack and God's deliberate closing. The enemy seeks to steal, kill, and destroy. He attacks to pull you away from God's will. But when God shuts a door, it will not reopen no matter how hard you try. You will sense in your spirit that the season is finished, that the opportunity has passed, that what once brought life now brings only unrest. This is not failure, it is divine redirection. The challenge is to trust his wisdom when you cannot trace his hand. So many people miss their blessing because they spend years standing in front of a closed door, begging for it to open again. They replay what they lost. They rehearse what they could have done differently. They anchor their identity to something God himself has already removed. And in their fixation, they miss the new door God is preparing to open. Remember the words of Scripture: "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? If your eyes are fixed on the old, you will not see the new. If your hands cling to the past, you cannot receive what he is extending in the present. Closed doors are not merely about loss, they are about protection. There are relationships you beg God to preserve that he allowed to end, because he knew the influence would have drawn you away from him. There are jobs you thought would make you prosperous that he withheld, because he saw they would ensnare your heart with pride and greed. There are paths you wanted to walk that he blocked, because he knew they would lead you into destruction. Every no that comes from God carries within it a greater yes, though it may not be visible yet. When you begin to see closed doors as signs of God's hand, your perspective shifts. Instead of despair, you feel anticipation. Instead of resentment, you feel reverence. You understand that the silence of heaven is not rejection but orchestration. The God who opens doors that no man can shut also shuts doors that no man can open, and both are expressions of his sovereign love. The hand that closes is the same hand that blesses, and he closes with the same care that he opens. There is also an element of pruning in this process. Jesus taught that every branch that bears fruit is pruned, so that it may bear more fruit. Pruning is cutting, and cutting is painful, but it is necessary for growth. The doors that close are often part of this pruning. They strip away what is unnecessary, they remove what is hindering, they make space for what is coming. Without pruning, the vine cannot flourish. Without closed doors, your life cannot bear the weight of greater blessing. You may find yourself in a season right now where everything seems to be falling apart. People you trusted are no longer with you. The work you depended on has dried up. Plans you built carefully have collapsed. It feels like God has turned his face away. But what if this is not his rejection but his preparation? What if the collapse of your plans is the clearing of the ground for his? What if every door shutting in your face is guiding your steps toward the one door he has appointed for you to walk through? There comes a time in the life of every believer when the familiar loses its flavor, when the things that once satisfied no longer bring peace, when the routines of life begin to feel empty, and when a deep stirring rises within the soul that cannot be silenced. This is not random frustration, nor is it simply the weariness of a busy life. It is the Spirit of God placing within you a holy restlessness. Before a great blessing, before God elevates you into a new season of calling, he unsettles you from the old. He makes you discontent with shallow living because he is preparing you for deeper waters. He shakes you loose from lesser loves so that you will be ready to embrace the greater purpose he has ordained. This holy restlessness is often mistaken for something else. Some confuse it with failure, thinking that if they were truly in God's will, they would feel content where they are. Others mistake it for weakness, as if they lack the strength to persevere. Still others see it as rebellion, believing that their desire for more must mean they are ungrateful for what they already have. But this restlessness is none of those things. It is God himself removing your appetite for what will not sustain you and awakening a hunger for what only he can provide. The pattern of this stirring can be seen in Scripture. Look at Moses, raised in the palace of Egypt, clothed in luxury, surrounded by privilege. He had every earthly reason to remain content. Yet the day came when he could no longer tolerate watching his people suffer in slavery while he lived in ease. That restlessness burned so fiercely in him that he left behind the palace, choosing to identify with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. God used that stirring to move him from comfort into calling, from Prince of Egypt to Deliverer of Israel. Without the holy unrest, Moses may have remained in Egypt, living well but dying empty. Consider Hannah, who year after year sat in the temple, burdened with the weight of barrenness. The cultural shame of childlessness pressed on her like a stone, and though her husband loved her, her heart could not rest. Her holy discontent drove her to the altar, where she poured out her soul before the Lord, refusing to rise until he heard her cry. Out of that restlessness came Samuel, the prophet who would anoint kings and lead the people of God. Had Hannah been content in her barrenness, she may never have sought God with such desperate intensity, and the blessing would not have come in its fullness. The same holy stirring filled the prophets of old. Jeremiah described it as a fire shut up in his bones, a burden he could not contain. Though he suffered rejection, ridicule, and persecution, he could not remain silent because the restlessness of God's calling burned within him. Amos said he was no prophet nor the son of a prophet, yet the word of the Lord came to him while he was tending sheep, and he could not go back to ordinary life. When God places that holy restlessness within you, the things that once seemed enough suddenly feel shallow, and you cannot go back to what you were before. This stirring often begins quietly. You notice that conversations you once enjoyed now feel empty. The entertainment you once consumed without thought leaves you unsettled. The circles of friends who were once your comfort now feel foreign. Your heart longs for something you cannot name, something beyond the surface of life. That quiet discontent grows until it becomes undeniable. You may try to silence it by distracting yourself with business, by filling your calendar, by chasing after new pleasures, but nothing works. The ache remains, and it follows you into every room, because it is not from outside of you, but within. It is God himself awakening your spirit to something more. Many resist this restlessness. They cling to the familiar, trying to convince themselves that if they just wait long enough, the feeling will fade. But what fades is not the stirring. It is their sensitivity to it. The tragedy is when men and women ignore the voice of God long enough that they become numb to it. They settle into comfort, silencing the holy dissatisfaction, and in doing so, they miss the blessing God was preparing. The restlessness is a gift because it shakes you out of spiritual sleep. It reminds you that you were not created to live for this world alone. It points you to eternity, to holiness, to a higher call. This stirring is not always about external change. Sometimes it is about internal transformation. God begins to convict you of sins you once excused. Words you spoke lightly now weigh heavy on your conscience. Habits you tolerated begin to grieve your spirit. It is as though the light of heaven shines brighter in the rooms of your heart, exposing corners you never noticed before. That is not condemnation. It is invitation. God is making you restless with sin because he is preparing to bless you with greater intimacy. He will not allow you to remain comfortable with compromise if he intends to entrust you with something weighty. At other times, the holy restlessness points you outward. You see needs you once ignored. You feel compassion for people you once overlooked. Your heart aches for the lost, the broken, the poor, and the hurting in ways you cannot shake off. You walk into places and feel burdened to pray. You hear of situations and cannot remain silent. That is not coincidence. It is God awakening a calling. The stirring you feel is his way of moving you from passivity to purpose. When you cannot rest where you are, it is often because he is calling you to go where you have never been. This restlessness will often cost you. It may separate you from people who are content to stay where they are. It may make you appear unreasonable to those who do not understand. It may require you to leave behind comfort, security, and familiarity. But what seems like loss is actually preparation. God is severing ties that would hold you back because the blessing he is preparing cannot be carried in the old environment. Just as Abraham had to leave Ur, just as the disciples had to leave their nets, just as Paul had to leave his old identity, so too you must allow the holy restlessness to move you into what God has prepared. You will know the restlessness is from God because it drives you to him. Ordinary frustration pushes you away from prayer, but holy unrest pulls you deeper into it. Ordinary discontent makes you bitter, but holy discontent makes you broken before him. Ordinary dissatisfaction leads to chasing after worldly fixes, but holy dissatisfaction leads to chasing after his presence. It is not a carnal hunger for more of the world. It is a spiritual hunger for more of him. When you feel this stirring, do not despise it. Do not silence it with distractions. Do not drown it with noise. Lean into it. Bring it before God. Cry out like Hannah. Wrestle like Jacob. Listen like Samuel when he said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." This is not a curse. It is a sign. It is God whispering that you were not made for where you are. It is his spirit nudging you, urging you, calling you upward.